Now, what are the considerations when you design a supply chain? First is credit and capital. Are you able to get resources to invest? If you want to invest in a processing facility and invest in inputs. Let's say in the United States, for example, Walmart doesn't finance their suppliers. They only finance themselves. The banking system is such that it allows you, that having a contract in Walmart allows you to get credit in the bank. But if you want to go to a developing country, farmers don't get supply, don't have credit. So if you are trying to develop a processing facility of coffee or flowers or whatever, a lot of time you have to provide credit to the farmer, or a third party need to do it. And I think that develop and understand creative finance in countries where you don't have well-functioning banking system and you have all the problems of information and ability to enforce contract is a big challenge to develop supply chain. Another thing is risk diversification. A lot of time you will have vertical integration if you cannot rely on your suppliers. If you have good extension, good human capital in production, you have a bigger system with big processing, and small farmers will do it. So ability to deal with different type of risk of weather, risk of performance, risk and reliability is important. Then you have issues of intellectual property and innovations. Okay, so I can generalize it to many systems, and basically all the time you have this in every stage of production, how much to produce inside, how much to produce out, what are the constraints, how to overcome credit, how to overcome risk. And to some extent, you can really develop, if you are in a business situation, the biggest challenge of business is to design a supply chain that will be optimal. So generally speaking, what we see in the world, and that's what Tom Reardon is speaking, is that once you have a new type of technology, there is a diffusion of supply system across countries over space and time. Once someone develops a supermarket in America, after a while someone will move it to India and Brazil, and you will have the same type of issue of designing supply chain in each country. But you have diffusion of innovations, diffusion of new organizations that all build on building a supply chain in each country, and it's an economic problem. So my feeling is all the descriptive work on supply chain can be interpreted and analyzed as a multi-stage economic decision maker of the entrepreneurs. And the outcome will be different depending on their situations. So what are my conclusions? The first thing is that the educational industrial complex is a key driver of innovation. And we need to have strong educational, strong knowledge base in order to move an economy forward. So even in a developing country, there is value to excellence in terms of developing technology. It doesn't need to be brain surgery, but it needs to be technology that is relevant to the activity. The agriculture and the system of innovation are becoming more and more privatized. That you need to develop systems that are supported both by the private and the public sector. We need to stop telling farmers what to do, but to help to create a system that the private sector will a lot of time implement innovation. Every time that you ask the question why farmers don't adopt something that the government produced, it's not a relevant question. If you have private companies and they have product, people don't buy most of their product and they go bankrupt. So to me, you need to move slowly to system where you have private sector that is bringing input. And of course, you need extension, you need public sector support, but we don't need to have a situation that that things are given, but rather that you allow market to develop. Technological change results in innovation, and when you have new innovation and new market, they start as a non-competitive enterprises. So if you see someone that makes money in a development, it's not a capitalist bad guy that exploits people. Sometimes it may be the case. It's an entrepreneur that wants to start something. Almost all the supermarkets in developing countries that I think are force for good didn't start by do-goers. They started by greedy businessmen that wanted to move forward. If you regulate it to some extent, it's good, but if you say that it's terrible, you have nothing. Now, markets are endogenous. Markets are not there existing. They are developed all the time. You will have new markets. You don't think in terms of what the market says, but you have to recognize that market is a byproduct of innovation situation. And the magnitude and management of supply chain depend on your ability to control resources, deal with risk, etc. And society needs to tolerate some degree of monopoly power in the short term, otherwise the rate of innovation will be slow. What are my implications? First, research needs to go beyond the farm gate. It's not enough to understand what peasants do and to have 2.5 million experiments on peasant behavior that, in my view, you know the outcome ahead of time. Sometimes too much rigor is waste of money. That's my view. You need to have a linkage between the research system and the product supply chain, and to understand what are the constraints of innovation, to understand adaptation of supply chain to new technologies like robot, IT, etc. You need to understand how supply chain operate and how businessmen think. A lot of time, people are married to big data that have a lot of million people and million activities, but sometimes you need to have small data on important agents and to understand it. It's not only enough to run regression, you need to understand literacy, to understand basically what people think and to understand how the big player operate. You need also to assess the various supply chain, not only in terms of their overall performance, but who is losing and who is gaining. When we move to introduce robotics and other things, they will introduce everywhere, there will be a lot of losses. Today, in the future, the main competitor of poor individual will be the robot. What do you do then? Now, the other thing, you need to start to invest in developing countries in data, infrastructure, research, human capital, understanding of marketing and credit and inventory management. We need to have more and more people that have technical knowledge and are in the sciences and information technology. We need to have more programmers. We live in a new age where things are digitized, you have new supply chains, you are more integrated, and you need to develop, even in developing world, this type of infrastructure, and again, to have public and private collaboration to deal with it. We need to move from ag policy, from agricultural policy, to agricultural and ag food system policy. So to recognize that we operate in supply chain. When we look at climate change, we don't need to look how climate change will affect peasants, but how climate change will affect all the supply chain, because a lot of time, if your port is destroyed, it doesn't matter that you produce a lot, you cannot export it. And if you are in a city and the port is designed, you are in trouble. And international organizations to develop mechanisms to enable transformation that take into account the private sector and work with the private sector rather than compete with the private sector, and to recognize that a lot of time underdeveloped world groups or countries wouldn't be able to deal with this transformation and help them to deal and be part of the transformation rather than exclude them from the transformation and in the long run make them worse off. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, David. So we've gotten three really interesting perspectives that are, sort of give us a preview of what's to come in some sense, and some framework for understanding, definitions and framework for understanding a lot of the issues we have to deal with. Excuse me. So I think we'll take questions about 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll go to the coffee break a bit late. So if we could have focused questions, not great long polemics, that'd be great. Okay, question over there.
Thank you very much for the 3 presentations. I have a question for each of you. So Joachim, on the conflicting drivers on bioeconomy, so how you foresee those? So basically competing for food. Conflicting drivers for bioeconomy, because at the end of the line, if I follow the model of Professor Silverman, I will maximize profits. So it could be that I will get more profits with more value added than with less value added. So that could create a conflict in terms of food availability. And that's linked to Regina's governance issue. So what do you foresee in terms of governance to minimize those potential risks of potential conflict drivers, and if there is something to be done? And Professor Silverman, linking to all of this, the bioeconomy complexity of the value chain is huge. So it's very close to impossible to evaluate any potential intervention within such a complexity of value chain. So how you will foresee your model, because your model will become a lot more complex. No? There are a set of prices, so everything becomes vectors of prices, vectors of products, and competition of inputs. So how complex will be your model? How feasible will it be to come up with a solution that will allow to optimize? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll take some more questions, and then we'll go to the answers. All the way back. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think my question is for Professor von Braun. And then when you put biologization of economy, and then my perspective from biological sciences, and then in terms of research priorities, you put climate change and variability, you put biodiversity, but we really miss the whole land health concept. Where are the soils? Where we produce, where you get most of our ecosystem services from. And then in the whole CGIAR system, one of the biggest research topics now we are really investing a lot is restoration of degraded landscapes, especially in Africa. So I don't know where you really put that one, and then because the whole bioeconomy system is going to be supported by, basic land health concept, and I would like to know your reflection on that. The whole, economics of land degradation, it, and then you take nutrient loss from the landscape and all these kind of things, but I don't see anything. Of course, Regina, you really touched it about the whole soil concept, so I would like to see your reflection on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Rob?
Carl, this is related to the previous question. Is the microphone on?
Yeah, to speak.
Regina marked increasing quality, increasing quality of inputs and ensuring soil water sustainability in the red. Quite interesting, because increasing agricultural productivity through fertilizer use in food insecure regions, like in most of sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's a goal for many of us. And then I wanted to ask to Joachim, is this a conflicting goal in the bioeconomy? And if this is, how can we change this into an integral part of the bioeconomy?
Maybe I'll let the panelists respond to these, and then we can take another round of questions if we have time.
Okay, does it work like this?
Yeah.
Maximo, on these, on the drivers, the 4 which I listed, virtually all of them work through price expectations. Consumer preferences probably also are influenced by change in education outlook and new knowledge. What's happening with this earth in the future, and what prices for livelihoods our grandchildren will have to pay. If you want to aggregate it that much, I find it difficult to see a point of entry for policy action. But theoretically, yes. On that little graph which I put there, we see three substantial fundamental drivers. Consumer preferences, technological innovation, expected resource constraints, and the sustainability concerns. I think number one investment would be in communicating a long-run outlook, and that's what our model building community needs to do. Essentially, that's what we are getting out of climate models, number one. Number two, the education system around the world is teaching kids of next generation. And we had an event with teenagers in the Vatican Academy. I was amazed to see how well informed 12 to 16-year-olds are about what's in the making for their future. And they ask very fundamental question: how shall we change the economic system so that we are not ending in a fundamental disruptive change of the negative kind? If you look at how heat waves and drought in end of the century will make, under the probability of between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20, half of the Earth uninhabitable. So that's where I think organizations and institutions like the World Bank also need to invest in changing the worldview in order to prepare for mind change and in order to trigger public investment. So that goes far beyond the appropriate incentive structures for innovation, for startup capital, and so on. I'm really grateful for the question regarding where is landscape, where is sustainable land use and soil. I should have made one more advertisement round of our book on economics of land degradation, which colleagues at IFPRI and Center for Development Research put out. I felt it wasn't necessary because it has been downloaded 200,000 times by now by Springer Publishers. I'm very much in agreement with what you said. This is where bioeconomy is most fundamental and requires the governance attention which Regina put forward on the non-priced goods and the very long-term resource base to pay attention to landscape design and soil management and not just to the buzzwords which I mentioned in general, water, soil, and biodiversity. The conflicting goals in the bioeconomy, I'm afraid, are not only between the traditional ones, food, feed, energy. I think we understand those quite well by now, but increasingly in the field between utilization of bio-based resources and health. The recent insights produced, for instance, by the Max Planck Institute of Chemistry in Mainz, Germany, which highlight the health implications of air pollution, dust generation in industrialized countries, such as parts of North America and Europe, leading to large morbidity and premature death effects that have been unknown so far. A bioeconomy which has not only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also particle emissions. The quality of air and rural parts of Europe and of many parts of North America, according to these pollution maps which the Institute has put out, are as bad as in urban areas. Maybe you were not as naive as I am. I thought air in rural areas, that's good to breathe. Take a careful look at these maps, and they relate to what we do with crop production, with how we manage the landscape in the fields, and how we keep livestock, and out of it come life and death informations for what one health experts and chemical pollution analysts can tell us by now. So we are into I think a whole research area in which we need to much more carefully look at the balance between enthusiastic support for bio-based solutions and the downsides. Let me leave it at that.
Regina?
One question relating to how to resolve these long-standing governance issues, such as low quality of input supply. And from a governance perspective, I believe there is really a need to pay more attention to the issue of collective action and the voice of the farmers, because there are no easy technical solutions to these problems. One can try to take the institutions that have worked in some country and try to implement it somewhere else, but unless there is some kind of political will to make that really work, and that political will can ultimately only come from farmers having a voice in the system, it will be very difficult to make that work. So this combination of, sometimes we also use this language of supply side strategy, so you strengthen the capacity of an agency to supply a service has to be accompanied by strengthening the ability of the service users to hold the supplier accountable. So some demand side or empowerment strategy needs to be accompanied. And even though there's a lot of talk about it, if one looks what type of support actually goes to farmers' organizations, what role do they play even at the international level, I think it is still rather limited. So I think there is certainly a need for that. And that also leads to Maximus' question. So what are actually the governance solutions for these conflicts or conflicting driving forces? And here again, I see a major challenge in the need for collective action, because these problems, and climate change is just an example, if you look at other issues, how to ensure global food security, if there is a major drive towards, in case of high fuel prices, using natural resources for bioenergy, for example. So there would be a need for a collective mechanism at the international level to resolve such issues. And as we have seen in recent years, the ability to act collectively at the international level very much depends on national politics. So to what extent are nations actually willing to collaborate at the international level? So the US is, I think, a good example. And here I do think we need to ask what are the underlying driving forces. And rising global inequality and rising inequality within countries is certainly one of the drivers of the kinds of governments that then are not willing to act internationally in form of collective action. So I think we need to pay much more attention to the issue of inequality and how that affects the ability to act globally, not only for the bioeconomy, but this is also relevant for the bioeconomy.
Thank you. David, a few questions? A few responses? Answers?
Maximo asked me, if you take my approach, how do you introduce market failure? Do you rely on the private sector? Of course not. Basically, I have only 15 minutes. Basically, our economic analysis, it basically is guiding everything, assume certain assumptions about firms that are wrong. We need to know how the agribusiness system operates, how businessmen operate, how supply chain, and then all the environmental consideration and equity consideration, the government and civil society have a role. But I think that today we don't have good indicators of how the private sector works. We don't have good understanding how the private sector owns. We don't collect the data about the private sector on big organizations. So we cannot develop good regulation if we have assumptions that are appropriate to the 18th century. So basically, it's not that I don't care. Of course, I'm an environmental economist. I'm new to this area. But I think that without understanding and real modeling of dynamic businesses and integrating supply chain, you cannot really develop good policies. So to me, I think the World Bank and other organizations really need to move from basically peasant economics to agribusiness economic when even a peasant is part of the agribusiness system.
Okay, with that, I'm going to call our first session to a halt and thank the speakers for a great start to our meeting this year, and invite everybody to go out and have some coffee, and aim to come back here in 10 minutes if you can, so we don't fall far behind. Although in the tradition of Ravello, we probably would fall behind. But anyway, so let's do what we can.
Denmark?
Start. Colleagues, may I ask you to take your seats? This is a global conference. We are not just meeting here in this room. We have a global audience. Let's be fair to them. I will introduce them in a moment to you. Please settle down. We have a super panel here before us. 3 guys anxious to speak. This is the Disruptive Plenary. That's how the organizers have called the session, the Disruptive Plenary. Let me interrupt your conversations. Please settle down now. Before I introduce our colleagues on the panel, I want to warmly welcome and acknowledge our global audience watching us online, including those who are at World Bank country offices for viewing our session. Not just viewing, because we will give you colleagues in Ethiopia and Nigeria also an opportunity to raise questions after we have listened to the speakers. So a warm welcome to colleagues joining us from Ethiopia, where representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Resources and the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency, the ATA, and various colleagues from the donor community are gathered in Addis at the World Bank office. Ethiopia's agriculture sector has shown phenomenal progress in the last decade. It's critical to the national economy. Those of you who know Ethiopia know that the agriculture growth performance was critical for economy-wide change in the important country. Those of you who follow political developments are also probably as excited as I am what's currently happening in Ethiopia with reform processes. We'd also like to welcome colleagues in Abuja, Nigeria, where our partners and stakeholders are gathered in the Abuja World Bank office. Agriculture is a high priority of the Nigerian government, seeking to diversify the economy, industrializing parts of agriculture and value chains and agribusiness. So we have audiences in key hotspots where bioeconomy, biotransformation, and so on is happening in Africa. We, by the way, had very high-level policymakers from both Nigeria and Ethiopia at the Global Bioeconomy Summit, including the chief economist from Ethiopia of the former prime minister. So, colleagues, that much for preparing the global audience. We have a set of speakers before us here. Tom Reardon, Maximo Torero, Joe Swinnen. Maximo, you will go first in this session, I understand. Second? Okay. Tom first. Tom in the middle. Thomas Reardon is at Michigan State University. Tom, we know you as Mr. Retail Revolution. So a retail revolutionary studying when others didn't yet pay attention to this transformative process in value chains. Tom Reardon was at IFPRI, and his work is all over the world, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. Tom, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak today about the very rapid transformation that's taking place in food systems, which is the totality of the supply chain, and I'll focus on from the farmer to the consumer rather than upstream, which will be treated by other people. Rapid transformation that's been occurring in both Africa and Asia in food systems. And I've called it a dual disruptive transformation, because I'm going to be speaking about not just, and now I discovered there's no place to put the water. There it is. No, it's okay. It's not just the supermarket revolution or modern retail transformation that I've focused on in the past, but also quiet revolution, which is a grassroots emergence of tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises along supply chains in Africa and Asia. So I'm going to be combining those and looking at those as a kind of double pincer changing the food system scene. And one thing that really strikes me is very often people think, I'm sorry, I have allergies. Very often people think that technological change, institutional change is on historical time, is gradual, is slowly building up. But in fact, what we've seen in our empirical work in both the modern revolution and the quiet revolution is that food system change in developing countries is happening extremely abruptly and suddenly, rapidly. So the image that you should have in your mind is one of a tidal wave. A tidal wave for maybe 1,000 miles in the ocean is only 6 inches tall. It's just a ripple across the surface. And then as it comes near the continental shelf, it surges up and becomes a giant change. And that's exactly what's happened in developing countries with the food system, where for thousands of years, the food systems in those countries, as well as what are currently the developed countries, were traditional systems. And then really over the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, there was a rapid transformation that has this image of a tidal wave. What has driven that sudden transformation is a collection of two kinds of changes. One are what I'll call meta drivers, which are basically things that affect all the parts of the system. And then within the food system itself, a confluence of 5 trends. And I'm going to emphasize through the talk that if you just take any one change by itself, it doesn't induce a very rapid change, but it's the confluence or all these rivers, I love that Latin phrase, confluence, it's all these rivers rushing together and causing a surge of power and change that's much faster than any individual change would create. And the overall drivers of the system change include the ones that you're familiar with: income growth, policy liberalization, massive investments, especially in Asia, but also to a certain extent in Africa, on public infrastructure. And then something that David Zilberman emphasized that I think is understood and extremely important in all this is the massive private investment that's driven all this forward. And not just the foreign direct investment that's often more visible, but in the agglomerate, a gigantic amount of domestic investment, both by large enterprises and by tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises. And then, of course, dear to your hearts is the other conditioner of this whole process, which is technology change, which is largely technology change and transfer from centers of innovation. And I think the emphasis that I have is that this is not only technology change that's occurring at the farm level, but also in every segment of the value chain. And you can think of this process as pulled by downstream forces, which include urbanization and diet change, and facilitated by midstream forces of food system change, and upstream fed by upstream change in farms and input supply systems. And I'll focus more on the downstream and the midstream in this talk. And I think one of the most disruptive facts of all standing in front of us is the fact that, for example, in this room 20, 30 years ago, the subject of the urban economy as a driver would have been marginal or absurd. If you look only a couple decades ago, Africa and Asia had 24% of their population in cities. Now, if you look at it, it's 40% in Africa and 45% in Asia overall. If you look at a place like Nigeria, it's already 50% urbanized, so that the changes have been abrupt in that. But these shares of population in urban areas actually understate the extreme importance of urban areas for the food system. We did a bunch of calculations using LSMS data and other, and we found that if you look at South Asia and Eastern and Southern Africa, basically 30% of the population, 30 to 35%, is in cities. But about 40 to 45% of the food consumption of the countries is in cities, and about 50 to 60% of the total market of food in these countries, the poorest in the world, are in cities already. And then if you look at Southeast Asia and West Africa, for example, Nigeria, you might find 40 to 50% of the population in cities, 50 to 60% more or less of the total food consumption already in cities, and 60 to 70% of the market of food is in cities. If you compare these numbers, 50 to 70%, with the share of food that goes to export, which is about 5%, this is 10 times more important than export. Cities are 10 times more important than the international market in terms of its effects on these food systems. So I'm focusing in on the transformations that are occurring in those. And when you think about it, the rise of the cities, just as it did in Europe, where London, back at the time of the American Revolution, was maybe 30,000 people, 50,000 people, as it grew, it had to start, Shakespeare's time, as it grew over the 1800s, it started to have to source over all of the UK and then internationally. And basically, the same kind of surge of rural-urban supply chain volumes has occurred in Africa and in Asia in the past 3 decades. If you look at just over a couple decades, there's been an 800% increase in volumes of food going along rural-urban supply chains. That is disruptive. And often, Africa is painted as a sleepy, stagnant, traditional food system, when in fact, if you think of that, it's a rapidly growing business of food. And in Southeast Asia, the figure is 1,000%. So urbanization downstream is a massive force that's inducing this overall change. Secondly is the change that's occurring in diets. And often one thinks about middle class, urban consumers being the ones that are changing and everyone in stasis. Our empirical work that we've been doing with LSMS and other data sets has shown that a lot of the changes that I'm going to mention quickly, and quickly I'm emphasizing, I know, are both in urban and rural areas, and not just in the middle class, but we've been surprised by finding that the poor are doing the same sorts of diet changes as the middle class. The first change, and I won't go a lot into the details because of time, but often there was a discussion of net purchasers of grain in the debate in the 1970s and 1980s. But the situation has gone so far that now, if the share of purchased food in total consumed food in rural areas in both Africa and Asia is something like half to 3/4. In other words, the consumption has rapidly commercialized. What does that imply? That it's not just rural-urban supply chains that we're talking about anymore when we're talking about transformation, but a rapid development of rural-to-rural supply chains and urban-to-rural supply chains. We've also found in our data work, and I won't go into the details very much, that there's been a massive rise of processed foods purchased as a share of total consumption. Even in the poorest areas in the world, it's something like 40%. If you go to Nigeria, it's already 2/3 of rural consumption is coming from processed food. And of course, these figures in urban Eastern and Southern Africa and rural Asia are around 50 to 60%, in urban Asia, 73%. And so what you find is that as you go from rural Africa to urban Africa to rural Asia to urban Asia, you find a continuum of change that's a moving average over time. And then urban Asia is very similar in its characteristics of consumption to the United States. Okay, so in terms of shares of processed food and diversification. And the final point about consumption is just this rapid diversification beyond grains, where now in value terms, 2/3 of food consumption in rural areas and 3/4 in urban areas comes from non-grain sources, and about 1/2 and 2/3 in Africa. So this picture of a tremendous change that's occurring downstream, pulling the changes that are occurring in the rest of the system, that needed to be facilitated. It would just end up in imports, but imports are only about 10 to 15% of food in developing countries. So the other 80 to 90 to 85% of food is being purveyed by the domestic supply chains. And those are undergoing a quiet revolution as well as a modern revolution that I'll discuss immediately after this. And they are, the changes that are occurring in the food system are, of course, fed by the upstream transformations, farming intensification, commercialization, and diversification, and input value chain development, which are changing, input value chains changing in many of the same ways as we're discussing for food systems. My fundamental point about food systems and what we've observed after our careful analysis of a lot of empirical data is that there's 3 stages of transformation that one observes. Basically, traditional food systems, which are waning and disappearing, transitional food systems, which are now, I would say, the majority of the situation in developing countries, and then modern food systems, which are emerging. And so I'll talk about 2 sets of transformation. One is from traditional to transitional, and one is from transitional to modern. I'll put a little bit more emphasis on the one, the transitional, the shift to the transitional stage, just because it's been much less discussed in the literature and in fora in the past years. And also, I would say that roughly 2/3 of developing country situations, this is just a rough guess, are in the situation of being in a transitional stage of transformation. This is very advanced in Asia, according to our work, and well along in Africa. And then the modern stage is occurring, let's say, roughly in 1/3 of the developing country situations. It's really very well along in Asia, and it's emerging in Africa. And when you think of these 3 stages of transformation, a very important point to emphasize is to see that they're overlapping, so that, as you can see in the line at the top, there's always going to be, and there has always been, the traditional food system in these regions. But it's waning very quickly as a share of total consumption. Then the dominant food system is the transitional one, which I'll describe, and then emerging is the modern one. And some of the clashes that are occurring and the disruption that is occurring is both transitional in the traditional situations and modern changes that are occurring alongside of transitional changes. So the traditional to transitional change we call the quiet revolution, not because it's not important or it doesn't exist or it's missing, it's because in the debate on food systems, there's been much less treatment of this angle, which is basically the rise of the small and medium enterprises as a major force. And what we've identified is that overall, this has been a very sudden fast, abrupt revolution, just like the modern one, but that it's been focused on domestic markets and domestic investments. As I go around and do a lot of research in various regions in Asia and Africa, various countries, policymakers are usually focused on export markets, okay, or maybe a modern sector, and feel that traditional markets are sleepy and stagnant and are not a source of major growth, and that the domestic market itself is not such a good bet in terms of change and opportunity. But we found that this revolution is based in the domestic market and based on domestic investments. The structural changes that are occurring in this transformation include lengthening supply chains driven by urbanization, diversification of those supply chains and value-added sector increases such as processed foods, et cetera, driven by diet change, and then the fundamental fact of the proliferation of tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises in processing, wholesale, third-party logistics, which includes transport, warehouse, and cold storages, and other services. So there's a gigantic emergence of these small and medium enterprises in the very recent decade. And the changes that have occurred in the food systems as these have emerged have been quite striking, and I don't have time to go into the details of it, but there's a lot of assumptions about how food systems works that have been fundamentally upended. For example, everybody in every audience I'm in the world talks about tied output credit market arrangements, holding back the transformation of the food system. But in fact, we found this to be nearly disappeared in all of the countries that we've been studying in both Asia and Africa. There's also been a shift away from traditional rural brokers to town-based wholesalers and third-party logistics. There's been a shift from unpacked bulk sale of grains, for example, to packaged branded milled grains. And with these changes in both structure and the commercial conduct, there's been widespread disruptive technology change. And everybody, many of the fora are focused on the newest and sexiest ones, which I hope to have time to get to, but I doubt it, which is the changes, for example, with robotization or with e-commerce. But in fact, I would say that 75% of the fundamental disruption that's occurring in developing country food systems right now are the basic ones that have been lived by developed countries already. Shifts from pastures to intensive use of feed, from capture to enclosure, from walking and horses to transport, the use of machines for transport, milling, farming, cooling, chemicals for farming and post-farm segments. These basic changes are the ones that are very rapidly happening right now and are the bulk of the change. Let me give you just a few examples. And I might not have time to get to the modern part, so I want to give you these examples to show how confluences of situations of change have led to extremely fast change that when I've been in these countries, very often this change has been under the radar, has not been part of the policy debate, and almost always the policymakers and many researchers have been surprised by the rapidity and volume of these changes. The first comes from our work recently on Bangladesh aquaculture, the fish. This is all for the domestic market. Nothing is exported from the fish farming in Bangladesh. This has grown 15-fold over the past 25 years, extremely rapidly, basically pushing out the capture fisheries. The feed sector in volume has tripled in the past 5 years. There's been a big shift away from the traditional varieties of carps that are still dominant to the fast-growing sort of factory fish, as David Zilberman calls them, tilapia and catfish that grow very fast, intensive in feed, and are very productive. And then finally, along the supply chain, there's been approximately a tripling of the small and medium enterprises in all of the segments, in hatcheries and wholesale and transport, in retail and in wholesale. Extremely rapid change in the supply chain as this fish farming supply chain has emerged and grown really only over the past decade, mainly. The second one, which we include because it's interesting for Ethiopia and also because very often people think that basic grains, non-traded grains, are not the food systems are not changing. But the amazing work that Bart Minton has been doing in Ethiopia has emphasized that in just the space of 1 decade, you've gone from something where you're walking the product to market or using a horse to move it to market to using vehicular transport. Something that let's say in European situation took hundreds of years for a transition. There's been also a huge jump in urban wholesale and milling, in restaurant and prepared sales of injera and milled teff that's occurred only over about the past 5 to 7 years. And then upstream, of course, midstream, there's been this large response by transporters and wholesalers to the growth of demand, but also farmers have changed, shifting varieties and intensifying production. So there's been this cascading set of changes that have occurred very quickly in this non-traded grain. And a third case that fascinates me is the one of the potato modern cold storages in Uttar Pradesh. And we also found the same thing in Bihar, in a poorer area. And what fascinated me is at the beginning of this research, both researchers, gurus, policymakers said, very unfortunately, you're going to find a stagnant food system and potato supply chain in India. And in particular, you're not going to find the presence of cold storages. So we went out and did this stack survey research and found a tremendous presence of the cold storages. In fact, in this area that feeds Delhi, and it's the largest potato market in the world, you had a shift at the end of the 1990s, 1% of the farmers were using cold storages. By the end of the decade of the 2000s, 99% were using cold storages. You went from very little of the potato in Delhi consumed from cold storages to 2/3 of it consumed from cold storages, with the attendant decline of seasonality, the attendant decline of prices, a basic huge revolution in the potato sector occurring in only 10 years, and all from small and medium enterprises investing in cold storages at a rate of 10% of cold storages growth per year over to the 2000s. And finally, very exciting for me, because we're doing this also now in a study on fish, but there is a lot of emphasis on the debate in Nigeria about imported frozen chicken. And there were amazing, I'm almost started actually, but you know, I'm obviously not going to go to the second part of the talk. The debate has focused on 2 points. One is how sad it is. This is what I hear everywhere. How sad it is that we have a stagnant, traditional, fragmented, not growing supply chain, in this case in chicken and feed. And that in fact, we are therefore forced to be mainly dependent on frozen chicken coming from Brazil and other places. Well, we did some initial analysis and discovered that instead of it being 50% of the consumption from frozen chicken, it's 15%. And then we further analyzed it and found a tremendous dynamism in the complex of the Nigerian maize and maize traders, feed, and chickens and egg complex. And in our work, we weren't focusing just on the farm level, but we paid a lot of attention to the maize traders, okay, because they're running essentially the feed sector. And it's fascinating to me because a lot of these forums focus on the farm. That's very important. It's 30 to 40, maybe 50% of the total value of food. But when you think about Nigeria, and you think about the food system for chicken or for maize, you have, let's say, maybe 1 million or several million farmers of maize at the bottom of an hourglass, or let's say at the top of an hourglass. And then at the bottom of the hourglass, where the maize is flowing, you have, let's say, 80 million families that are buying maize, okay? 80 million consumers that are buying maize. And so in between those two, you have 10 to 20,000 traders that are deciding essentially the evolution and the performance of that food system. And yet we did an analysis of the literature and found no one had done a large-scale survey of maize traders anywhere in Africa in the past 100 years that we could find. 100 years, okay? There have been some cases here and there. And so there's a huge lack of information, not only, as David Zilberman was saying, of what agribusinesses and larger enterprises are doing, but a basic understanding of what these small and medium enterprises are doing in the sector. And we found a huge growth, not only at the farm level, at the small and medium enterprise scale level of chicken farming, an intense involvement of women. Marketing is emerging quickly to the growing towns. And this is not just in southern Nigeria where we expected it, but also occurring in northern Nigeria. And the thing that struck me most and led to this growing feeling that I have that there's a big convergence between what's happening in Africa and what I see in Asia is that the feed sector is growing as fast in Nigeria as it is in Bangladesh. 600% in 10 years. And all of this is under the radar screen. This is this hidden, the hidden middle that I find in the debate. When I ask experts, just like I did in Asia, I asked experts, is the feed sector growing? They said, well, there's a lot of imports. No. Is the feed sector here growing in the use of feed? Over 10 years, how much would you guess? They'd say 50%. And then the actual number was 600%. So a lot of this massive disruptive growth that's occurring in the basic part of the food system is unperceived and extremely important. Yeah, so I was going to then talk about the modern food system change, but I won't, okay, because of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You hear that we are grateful. Professor Reardon focused on transformation and revolutionizing food systems. Let me refer to something which is currently prepared by another community. The 130 academies of science in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas are just completing a 3-year project on what research priorities for future food and agriculture systems to be tabled to the science ministers at G20 in Argentina. I think it's very good, Tom, how you emphasized and outlined the transformative power of changing food systems in society, and I'm sure we will come back to that. I think it's important that the World Bank and our community relates also to these academies of science efforts worldwide, and we become a community. Let's now listen to Maximo Torero on disruptive information across the value chain. Maximo has been introduced already as the executive director at the World Bank Group for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. He was a division director and a global player at the International Food Policy Research Institute. You find a bio in the material. Maximo.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Joachim. So what I'm going to talk a little bit is about some disruptions. Since this conference were started to be planned, I have been dreaming with disruptions. So I hope I can reflect my dreams in this presentation and where I'm looking at. So first, as everybody knows here, the world that we are facing today is a world that has a huge demand for calories and for food. We have to increase production around 60% to be able to arrive to the potential world demand. At the same time, we are facing risks, but I normally focus more when we talk about climate change, not only on extreme temperatures, but also on volatility and the variance, the second moment of weather and how that will affect farmers. The ecosystem decline, 25% of the production, of the productivity is only going to happen unless we increase land, and that means eliminating forests, or water also is becoming a very scarce resource in the world, and land is deteriorating quality. And finally, we have surprises, no? Like the eruption that just happened in Hawaii and also happened in Guatemala, and so on and so forth. So there are many surprises that are happening in this world, and that means that we need to be ready. And we not only need to be ready, but we need to have a great balancing act. We need to close the food gap. We need to support economic development. 28% of global population, directly or indirectly, is engaged with agriculture. And at the same time, we need to reduce the environmental impact, the 24%. So what to do? And that's where innovations and disruptions could help revolutions in technology could help to achieve this. But it's complex because of this balancing act. So let me start with my first disruption. I have 4 disruptions today. And let me explain a little bit about it. So my first disruption is what has happened in terms of automatization. And basically, this is just a graphical reflection by Professor Cork of the evolution of tractors. It came from being used by horses to machinery, and now to very sophisticated equipment, big equipment, and very sophisticated equipment. But the problem with this is that this is mostly for large farms because of economies of scale. So it requires significant, but it has been a huge disruption, what we have seen in the savannah with all the efforts of Embrapa, what we have seen in the coast of Peru, for example, and in many other regions of the world, technology and automatization has helped amazingly to increase productivity and velocity of harvest to be able to get the results we want to achieve. Now, one of the problems with this technology is the size and the weight of the equipment. And the reason is because they want to sit well-fed people like me in those tractors. And they need the space to do that. And they need the space to put the GPS locators and all the automatization. And that creates a problem. Why? Because it creates pressure over the land and therefore affects the quality of the soils and generates potential externalities into it. And the evolution of the tractor size have created those potential problems that we need to look at it carefully. But at the same time, using these large technologies for large-scale production, we have been able to evolve and develop new things. The top graph is showing how initially we were doing the weeding with a lot of labor intensity. But now there are new technologies that have been developed. Blue River technology has just been purchased, for example, by John Deere, the tractor company. And they are able now to really focus and eliminate automatically this monster, which basically is the weeds, which basically affects the productivity because affects the nutrients that come to the plant. And normally the technology didn't allow you to target properly. What this new technology of Blue River does is basically allows you to specifically target the weeds and use the herbicides specifically for those weeds. What it means that I won't contaminate the plant, and it means I won't kill the plant too. And it's very important because it helps specifically to eliminate and to work with organic farming, which we are very intensive today, and we want to move towards organic farming in many cases. But now I won't contaminate them because I will be able to target with this specific technology developed by Blue River, and which John Deere has captured. They paid $305 million for this enterprise. Luckily, it's of an uncle of mine, so it's great. So the issue now is how is really John Deere going to evolve on this, or is John Deere going to capture this, not use it, and therefore eliminate the potential growth of this type of technology? The hypothesis, I was in John Deere town last week, and is that they are going to use it and they are going to expand it. And not only that, they are going to do something else onto it, which is linked to this issue, which is what really concerns places like the bank and all the multilateral organizations. And it's extremely important because we need to show that multilateralism works. And is that agriculture is primarily a source of livelihood in emerging countries, but particularly in smallholders. So what we see here is that the distribution of agricultural holdings are basically smallholder based, around 84%. And of the agricultural labor force, 40% is female. But across the different regions of the world, with exceptions, and Latin America is one of the biggest exceptions, Brazil, the case of the coast of Peru, not the Andes, but in Senegal, in Ethiopia, in India, especially in Asia, we see, and in China, although China is changing very fast, we see that smallholders are really there, and we need to find ways to be flexible. So those large technologies, those large tractors, no matter we have now this great technology to be able to target the weeds, needs to improve. And that brings me to my disruption number 2. And this is basically, and I will show you a little video, this is the plant of of Amazon. Basically, they are using very small, flexible robots to be able to develop what normally people were going to develop. So they are creating a technological change and innovation where technology is now flexible to scale. And I am very smart in combining the use of these robots with the use of the size of the spaces and how I can optimize my allocation and my delivery of the products I need to sell, and the way I have to move around commodities to be as efficient as possible, and trying to optimize how I allocate. So this is the value chain concept, I think, that David and that was talking before. Now, is this happening in agriculture for smallholders? Yes, it's starting to happen, and very fast. So these are very small tractors that can play a significant role in agriculture today, and that can allow you to do many of the things that I mentioned before. And at the end, what we are going to observe is something like this in the small plots. So small robots which are going to do the job in very small scale, so scale neutral, not necessarily will need anymore a large plot. And the economic case of these robots is pretty good. It's $10,000 each of them. And they can move basically at a quarter the velocity that the bigger tractor, and they can cover a significant area of space. The issue is how we afford the cost and how we eliminate the budget constraint, and that's where new ideas, like for example the idea of the Uber tractor, or innovative ideas which will allow us to share this type of technologies, will allow us to basically use this type of robots. These are another option, another way of, these robots, for example, not only look at the weeding, but also they do soil samples, which is crucial to look what inputs I need to apply to the field, which normally we don't do. We normally deploy very smart subsidies, very fancy mechanisms, and we never know what are the micronutrients we are giving to the soils and not what they really need. And this type of technology will allow to do that. So how we can reduce the budget constraint, I think, is central, and it's something that we need to look at it carefully. Now, but this type of technologies and this type of disruptive technologies require, and we need to be careful in many elements, because of inclusion, because of efficiency, and because of innovation, because I want to scale up and expand the access of this technology around. So what are the three key elements that I think are important? First is the access, which is linked to costs, adaptability to the location, in this case scale neutral, trying to move to small plots, small farmers, which is our priority. And third is appropriate. And appropriate means for me capability. So how I can transfer this type of technologies to an aging population in rural areas, a population which doesn't have education, and so on and so forth. So how we can comply with that. And let me bring an example that I like working a lot, which is ICTs. So as you know, the growth of cellular phones and ICTs has been huge. Now, the red line, which is basically the number of cellular phones in the world, is higher than the population. This graph goes until 2013, but if we do it up to today, it has grown furthermore. Not only that, it has expanded around the world. People initially didn't thought that it would go to rural areas. It has expanded all over the world, and the world is now based on an internet population. And there are many things that are happening in terms of access to internet around the world. We have web traffic, tweets, and so on and so forth. But as it was reported in the WDR 2016, the problem is what is happening between and within countries and in access to capability. And here is where we see differences. We see difference in income access. We see difference between young and old. We see difference between rural and urban. And we see difference between women and men. That's one of the concerns of these disruptive technologies, because they can increase inequality in all of these fronts. So how we can do to avoid that, and how we can comply with those 3 A's that I mentioned before to try to minimize that risk. And this is just a subsample of some countries looking at the gap of cellular phones in rural. Normally, we get reports from ITU, which is aggregate numbers for the country. But when you go into surveys and look exactly at what is the difference between the rural, you will see that in many countries like Tanzania, for example, the gap between urban and rural is huge. The average number for the country is big, but within rural and urban is important and something to look at. So we have a significant digital divide in the case of a technology which has already diffused massively, and there is a lot of things that we can do to be able to reduce this divide. So this could be because of productivity bias, because of a skills bias, or because of voice bias. But we need to find solutions to that, and trying to find ways in which we can optimize from that disruption that we want to create with these technologies. So here is where the concept of complements that I refer in the morning plays a role. And that's where we need to be prepared to be able to make these technologies feasible. So with complements, meaning that we have the institutionality, the regulation, the governance behind, the digital technologies could create innovation, could create efficiency, could create inclusion. But if we don't have the complements in place, it could create concentration, it could create inequality, and it could create problems of control and not inclusion. And that's what we need to avoid. That's why we need to move in parallel, and places like the World Bank has to be ready to be able to do that in place. And why? Because we need to have the regulatory systems in place, the skills, and the institutions in place to be able to comply with all this process of the technology evolution, which could be emerging, transition, and transforming. The advantage of technology is that it can leapfrog very fast. So if we are not ready from the beginning, then we could have a lot of problems. And that's what we need to avoid. And that's where I think multilateral institutions and research institutions have to play a significant role. This is basically to show the race between technology and complements, between high income, which are the green, upper middle income, which are the blue, and lower middle income, which are the red, and low income. The typical relationships that we'll have expect with these complements. if we are going to invest in either the most poor countries in the bank or in middle income or low middle income or poor countries, we need to move fast and we need to leapfrog those in the bottom to the top to be able to profit from these technologies because the technologies are ready, as I mentioned before, to be able to do that. So the second element is the content, which I call adaptability. In the case of phones or in the case of internet, is what we want. We want good content for the farmers. We don't want to provide them content which is not necessarily what they want and what they need. And that's typically the case. So there are several things that people refer to of the beauty of ICTs: extension, market information, policy environment, natural resource, and health. But when we did a review together with Nakasonia and Barminten, we found in this summary of a graph, basically we split it by low value crops, mixed crops, and medium and high value crops. And the horizontal axis shows the level of penetration. The major impact happened when the penetration of cellular phones was very low. This is the famous fish case of Kalali fishes that was done, and also many of the papers at the beginning when the penetration of cellular phones was very low because the asymmetry of information was huge, and therefore they could make a difference. But when we move into high penetration like we have today, only when we provide high quality of information, we have a difference. And that's the extreme right in the graph, those 2 or 3 papers that show certain impact when we do a proper impact evaluation. High value commodity, high penetration, but good quality information. So the quality of the information is central and matters and allows you to be able to use it. If not, the technology won't matter. That's why we need to have technology that has the proper content. And then capability, which is one of the biggest constraints because illiteracy is huge around the world, and especially in the countries matters for us to be able to move people out of poverty. So how we transfer these technologies, how we transfer these fancy robots that do all these different things to these poor people that most of them don't know how to read and write, and they will find ways to access to the technology. Many of them will have cellular phones. And the way to do that, for me, is to move in what I call my disruption number 3. And the disruption number 3 is milagros, miracles in English. Milagros is a kid from a secondary school, at the age that some of the previous speakers mentioned. She works in Yacanora, in Cajamarca, in Peru. And the idea of Milagros was for her to be the bridge. Normally, when we talk about stopping smoking or environmental issues in a school, we teach kids to do it so that they can teach parents, what we call upward intergenerational mobility. The advantage of Milagros is that she knows how to read and write, she knows pretty well mathematics, and she knows how to access to internet. It took her 24 hours to learn how to use the web, compared to teaching the same to a person of 50 or 70 years old. I cannot do many things today in internet. So, why Milagros is important? Because we have some evidence that the effect of parents to children could influence. The influence to children to adults has been studied by several social disciplines, but not economics too much. And recent studies that have studied the reverse direction of the transmission of information are present, but we have never tested really the upward intergenerational mobility. If I chuck information to the kid, how much it gets to the parent, how much the parent will adopt that change. And that's basically the role of Milagros. Milagros for me is the bridge, the translator that will give the information to the parent in such a way that the parent can apply it. Typically, when I have a smartphone and they don't know how to read and write, they will use Milagros to do what they need to do because they know what they want. Farmers are very rational. So there are 3 works that we need to test this hypothesis. One is kids to kids. First, trying to see if we can provide through ICTs information to the kids that will change their behavior. And we did this with nutritional issues, and that worked pretty well. The paper is already published in the American Economic Journal. From kids to parents, we did it in 2 ways, with technology and without technology. And what we found is that it changed the behavior of parents, so the upward intergenerational mobility helped. So the role of Milagros as a bridge did work. So this is to try to resolve these issues of extension by going even more sophisticated things that kids can do. So the idea was to test if IT extension provided to students translating to increase agricultural knowledge to parents, and how much it translated into adoption. And basically, the idea was to go extension through the kids and then influence parents. And in India, they did this empirically in several cases, also in other regions. But this is a formal randomized control trial to try to test something which clearly has a very easy way of doing external validity because it's very simple to replicate. And the other advantage is that it's cost-effective because I can go to schools. And I have the concentration of the kids which normally work in their farms. That's the typical case. Most of these kids in secondary school in rural areas will work from the farm. So we did this design. And I am not going to go into detail, but we identify all the problems that the farmers were facing in the plots, and then we try to bring solutions through the schools, through videos, to the kids, through internet, so that they can then see if that tests the kids. And we comply with all the rules of randomization. These are the types of videos that were simple to use because we wanted to minimize the budget constraint issue to try to bring this is a solution, for example, for corn earworm. So some technology, so we basically did this ITT specification. We also did an ATE specification, and the result basically is that first knowledge is transmitted. We were able to transfer knowledge to kids. We are able to have a significant increase of 21 to 30%, so 6 to 9 percentage points in terms of knowledge. We also were able to identify in the late the similar impact. So using random assignment as an instrument for watching the video, we find a similar significant effect. And then we also look at the heterogeneous effects, and as the typical effects we expect, we found education, like smaller gains among less educated responsible household member, larger gains if responsible member is male, age, larger gains if responsible member is younger. Then we'll also look at adoption of agricultural practices. We have a set of questions to the parents to see if they will adopt the technology, and we found that we increased the adoption of the technology in 3.2 to 4.9 percentage points with a small sample that we have. If we had a bigger, bigger sample, which we are trying to do now, we'll have a bigger, of course, impact. And the same with the late. So what we find at the end is that implemented field experiment to teach agricultural practice to high school students work. The information is transmitted. And when a student is taught on agricultural practice, the knowledge of the farm manager increases by 6 to 9 percentage points, 20 to 30%, and the adoption of the practice increased between 3.5 to 5 percentage points, 60 to 23%. So the role of Milagros as a bridge apparently works, and it will help me to transfer faster these technologies and try to leapfrog. So finally, because I only have 2 minutes left, my disruption number 4. And my disruption number 4 is very linked to complements and to policy making. And normally policy making, for me, in most of the cases, is a market failure. Because we make decisions without serious evidence. And that could create problems, especially when we have this type of technologies. So normally we have a small problem, and we try to use technology to solve that problem. But given that we don't have the proper evidence, we increase the problem. And what we do is we bring more policy things, and we complicate more the problem. And at the end, we create a big mess. So let me finalize with that and tell you that there is a huge effort that we need to do to be able to comply with these complements to profit from these technologies. Thank you very much.
Well, Maximo, thank you so much. Disruptive information. For disruptions, we will not only remember the last one, but also the automatization, the robots, the miracle kids can do, and the framework of access, adaptability, and appropriateness. We'll get back to you. Jo Swinnen on disruptive regulation of value chains. Professor Swinnen is at Lycos Center for Institutions and at University of Leuven in Belgium. He was at the World Bank, a lead economist and an economic advisor at the European Commission. Jo Swinnen was also president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. I refer to the bio in the handout. Jo, you have the floor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Joachim, for this introduction. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back at the World Bank and at the Biotechnology Consortium as well, and of course to share the podium with Tom and Maximo. The topic I was asked to cover is on disruptive regulations and value chains. It's a very broad topic because you can think about regulations on, there's so many different types of regulations. Think about taxation, competition policy, trade policy, etc. So I had started putting a number of things together based on work I've done before and some recent work, and I had twice as much slides as Tom had. So I said, this is not probably going to work, so I have cut out a whole bunch of things. So I'll start with a few conceptual slides, then some historical stories, because I think history provides a huge a huge amount of information on regulations and their effects. And then I'll end with some fairly recent work on basically on the position of farmers in value chains and value chain regulations in Europe, actually. So a lot of my presentation is a bit biased towards European regulations because I think they played a very important role in the value chain developments, but also because there's a lot of things going on. That's the region I know best. If we talk about disruptive regulations, a key point of my talk will be that there is a two-way interaction between those. Okay, so regulations can have disruptive effects, but there's a lot of disruptions that have occurred in history or in the markets which have led to regulations, and I'll basically document both of these things. Just to give you a feeling about history, okay, so I had a whole series of slides on history. I just kept one. And this is from 4,000 years ago. This is from the laws of Babylon. And this is probably the first document or written food regulation, if you want, that we still know of. It's literally written in stone, okay? And it says, if a wine cellar makes the measure for drink smaller than the measure for corn, they shall drown her in the water. So it's certainly disruptive for the person who basically is the wine cellar. Let's start with a few conceptual issues, okay? So I have this is the simplest model you can think about of regulations, I think. So regulations can serve from a social perspective, social optimization perspective, to address a number of things. So one of this could be, for example, reduce asymmetric information, could be to reduce externalities, etc. Okay, and so let's assume this is kind of an Akerlof lemon problem, so that the consumers and the producers have asymmetric information about the quality of a product, and the government can intervene to try to address this by introducing a regulation, right? So consumers' utility is a function of the utility they have from consuming the product minus their expenses on the product, so the P times X, price times the level of consumption. Producers have profit from basically selling the product, and they have an implementation cost, which is related to the introduction of the regulation. So what's the impact? Consumers, producers, and total welfare. Well, consumers benefit because their asymmetric information is reduced, and so they consume better products, okay? But they have to pay a price for it, because the price will go up for two effects. One, there's a demand increase, and the second one, there's an implementation cost increase. The impact on the producers is they face the cost of introducing the regulation, but at the same time they can sell more because consumers want to buy more, and there is a price increase, okay? So in both of these cases, there's a positive and a negative effect. If we then look at total welfare, then essentially it's the trade-off between the gains or the consumer gains because of the reduced asymmetric information and the implementation cost, okay? Now what's interesting, there's a couple of things here. One, first of all, is that the social optimum is most likely not zero, okay? So the zero regulation is not the social optimum in a number of cases. And the second thing is that, can you see this? Yes. So this term here, the second term in both cases, is identical, and that drops out if we look at the total welfare. It's essentially a transfer between consumers and producers, okay? But of course it matters, okay, if we think about the politics of the regulation, and also if we think about things like inequality or income distribution, which we may also care for other reasons than politics. So if you look at the comparison between the social optimum and the political optimum, if you specify some kind of a Grossman-Heltman type of political economy function, basically in the politics, okay, the rent distribution does matter. Okay. Now this is a simple way of specifying this thing, and it has very powerful implications. The first one is that unlike when we look at tariffs or quotas, okay, the zero tariff level, zero quota level is not the same social optimum when you look at regulations, okay? And so there's really good work done by people like John Begin, Stefan Maret, Frank van Tongeren, etc. And so they essentially have said both conceptually these things are complicated and empirically they're very complicated because you need all kinds of data measurements to actually identify the social optimum. If you then look at the politics, okay, then basically it gets even more complicated because lobby groups obviously are going to try to push the regulation in the way that affects their rent distribution towards themselves. And so these factors that have influenced both the political and the social optimum have also to do with education, skills of producers, access to finance, quality of institutions, infrastructure, etc. Then, so this is a static story. If you bring in the dynamics, okay, and I think if you look at history, the dynamic aspects of regulation are really important, is that once regulations are introduced in a certain country or a region, companies adjust, consumers adjust, etc. And basically, that means that in the long run, comparative advantage is going to change, and basically consumer preferences may change. This will turn into some kind of what I call a regulatory inertia, kind of a hysteresis of these regulations. And so that means that changes in regulations, if you look in history, they often require shocks to the system. Okay? And these shocks can be internally, you can have food safety crises, things like that, or they can be external, think about globalization, international integration. All right? So what I'm going to do now, the rest of the presentation, is basically document a number of these things. So I'm going to very quickly go through a number of historical cases, and basically then the last part of the presentation, I'll talk about some very recent attempts at regulation of the value chains. So let's first start with the, okay, so a key conclusion that comes out of these things, okay, is that international integration, okay, and also globalization as a different concept of this, if you want, may lead to the removal or the reduction in regulations, and it may also lead to the expansion of these regulations. Now, is this good or bad? That depends whether the regulation you started from was a good one or a bad one, okay? So now this seems very wishy-washy, right? But that's essentially, conceptually, it's a very powerful result and something which you see continuously if you start looking at these regulations. Okay, so the first big shift, if you look at modern food regulation, food standards, really comes from the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, on the one hand, transforms the way we produce food. I mean, a lot of things change. We can certainly start mass-producing food, processing, consistent production, etc. It becomes possible. At the same time, it also allows people to test what's actually in the food that is being sold. And it turns out there's a lot of stuff in the food which is not supposed to be there. This is a very important book in that thing. It's from 1820 from Professor Accum, okay, and it's called a treatise on adulteration of foods and culinary poisons, okay, the fraudulent sophistications of bread, beer, wine, etc. Okay, and so the subtitle is "There is Death in the Pot." So he finds out there's lots of stuff in food which is sometimes the cheap stuff. Okay, it's not poisonous, not unhealthy. It's just not supposed to be there because the people say there's something else in the food, but some of it is also poisonous. This leads to essentially modern food regulations introduction. And so what's very interesting is that these are three countries, if you look from a global perspective, which are very close to each other, yet they use three quite different ways of regulating their food system. Britain has what we call a negative list approach. Essentially says you cannot put any poisonous things in food. That's essentially it, okay? If you put sheep stuff on it, it's fine, just put it on the label, but you cannot put unhealthy things in there. France does something different. They essentially define what food is. So they define what wine is, they define what chocolate is, they define what other types of food is, and they said this is how you have to produce the food. So it's a recipe approach. Germany has kind of a different, kind of a mixed approach. It uses kind of on the public regulation side, it follows the British approach, but then a lot of the private sector and the associations actually introduce the recipe type of approach that France is using. So it's a mixed public-private regulatory approach. Now, so this is, let's see, this is 1860 till 1910, so around 1900, let's say. These have really long-lasting impacts. So we've done a number of case studies on this, one on the chocolate sector, the other one on wine, beer, and a number of other sectors. And so what we see, what we've documented in these cases, that sometimes 70 to 100 years later, these regulations have major impacts when these countries come together, in this case in the in the European Union, but it can also be, for example, in the world market, where they have to compete with each other or try to sell their products and things, okay? And so, for example, in the chocolate war, there, it took 30 years after Britain joined the EU to come to a compromise regulation, which has a bit of both the regulatory approaches of France and Britain. The wine war in the EU, this is where basically essentially the very regulated market of France, or the very regulated French system, was basically mixed or integrated with the much less regulated system of Italy. And this ultimately led to the expansion of the very extensive regulations under the French system to the entire EU at this point. Okay. Then, another big shock to the system was in the late 1990s. We had several food crises in the European Union, a number, most importantly in Britain and Belgium, including the mad cow disease, etc. And so this led to a total transformation of the EU food law, of the EU food regulation. And I am arguing here, or I will argue and document in a second, that these had really big impacts on basically regulations across the globe. They had disruptive implications both among the countries, horizontally, in terms of trade, and then also along the value chain in a vertical way. So let me just illustrate a couple of these things. This is, on the left-hand side, these are SPS notifications to the WTO, and you see they have grown tremendously after 2000. And on the right-hand side is an indicator of private regulations, so these are global gap certified producers in the world, and you also see that after 2000, these things have grown very strongly. Now, we've done a number of studies on the impacts of that. I'm just going to show you very briefly 2 slides, but of course, already other speakers today, such as Tom and David Zilberman, have talked about these things. So this is how they affected, for example, global farm structures. So this is basically where the purple line goes down. This is around 2000, so that's when the regulations are introduced and tightened in the EU, and it really affected basically some of these value chain supply structures in Africa. This is data from Senegal, actually, and so smallholder participation really went down afterwards. This is data from Eastern Europe, where the farmers there are being confronted with these EU regulations at the time of accession. So we did it's a panel data, so we surveyed a couple of hundred dairy farmers, very small dairy farmers in Bulgaria in 2003. We went back in 2009. And 6 years later, 1/3 of the farmers had quit, okay? And among the ones that were still there, you see kind of a dichotomy that some fall back on pure subsistence farming, just keeping 1 cow, and the rest grows and becoming fully certified and basically having larger farms. And so the impact on the quality is very dramatic as well in a short time period. Okay, if we now look across the world, basically we've seen that this growing number of SPS regulations have led to a number of trade conflicts. This is a table from a report we have done just now for the European Parliament, which asks us to study these things and basically how all these regulations are affecting trade in the EU, agri-food trade, of course. And so what you see is on the left-hand side, this is the number of complaints. So this is, they call them special trade concerns against these SPS regulations because they are considered trade distorting. And you see what's on the left-hand side is complaints against SPS measures of some countries. On the right-hand side, it's complaints submitted by certain countries. So what's interesting is that the EU is #1 in both cases, and the US is #2 in both cases as well. And actually China is #4 in both cases as well. Okay? So that means that, for example, in the EU's case, it is actually launching most of the complaints against other countries, but it's also receiving most of the complaints against its own SPS regulation. What we've seen in terms of how these things get resolved, it's kind of good and bad news in the sense that roughly half of these SPS complaints have been resolved in a relatively short time, and this was mostly things where there was clearly not an intention of distorting trade. It was more like bureaucratic problem, institutional problems, etc. But half of the cases were not resolved in a short time, and there the issue is much more, I think the politics is much more important. Let me just skip this one. If we look at new trade agreements right now, then you see that regulations are becoming increasingly important in these new trade agreements. And there's 2 examples from the EU. One is the trade agreement with Korea and one with Canada. And in both cases, these regulatory issues have been very important. And one example of this is the spread of geographical indications in these, or the much more important role of geographical indications in these trade agreements. This is actually from, I've put this one in from, this is from 2016, and it says the TTIP talks between the EU and the US are bogged down in food standards debate. Basically, reflecting at this particular time the situation, and I think 2 years later the situation is very different because TTIP is more or less dead, I think, at this particular point. Okay, I see I have 3 minutes left, so let me then talk quickly about the last point. So here again is a big disruption in our system which led to a series of regulations or demand for regulations. So this is the food price index. I'm sure all of you know this picture very well. And so the question is here, are farmers disproportionately affected by price volatility in the value chains? Okay. And so this question, and so farmers group have said yes, and so therefore the government has to intervene, has to protect us against what I call unfair trading practices of other agents in the value chain. And so the questions that we have tried to address is, are they differently affected? What's the best policy reaction? What regulations have government introduced? And should there be harmonization of these regulations? So this is a picture just on the price line, and you see they don't come out so different, but the one with the biggest fluctuation, these are farm prices. The one with least of the fluctuation are the consumer prices, and the processor prices are in between. So this already it suggests that is indeed the case. What we've tried to do is we try to measure this, and so we've used a methodology from DeLuca and Warczynski. It's an American Economic Review paper, which essentially is providing a methodology which is used in I/O a lot in terms to measure markups, okay? And markups can be used for a variety of things. For example, one is for anti-competitive behavior. And so we have been able to get access to a data set where we have data for agriculture, food processing, food wholesale, and food retailers. And you see it's roughly 70 or 80,000 firms which are in there over a period from 2006 to 2014, which is exactly the time when we had these big price fluctuations. And so what we find is that the volatility of these markups are indeed much higher in agriculture than in the other stages of the value chain. And so they're roughly 3 to 4 times as high in agriculture than in the food processing, wholesale, and the retail. Okay? What's interesting then, if we looked at different subsectors of agriculture, we find not much difference there. So we find this high volatility in all the agricultural subsectors. But if we look then at the size effects, and there we did not have any ex-ante expectation what would be, we find that across all the value chain levels, but also especially within agriculture is the red top line, you see that the markup volatility is much higher for smaller farms than for larger farms. Okay, so somehow larger companies and larger farms seem to be able to deal with this volatility environment, a volatile environment, much better than smaller farms are. Okay, so what have governments done? This is the last time. So essentially, like 150 years ago, so there's been different approaches of how to deal with these complaints of unfair trading practices. And so there's been 2 extremes, if you want. I've summarized them, but here is the list of so we've basically made a list of all the 28 countries in the EU of how they have dealt with these claims for unfair trading practices. And so the top ones are the most restrictive ones. I mean, the countries which have intervened strongest, and the ones at the bottom which have intervened not. For example, Denmark and Luxembourg, there the governments have said, well, the instruments, we have the legal instruments, such as basically anti-competitive regulations, contract law, etc., and the institution that we have should satisfy. We're not going to do anything special. In Belgium, for example, this number 21, there has been a voluntary system for dispute settlements between farmers and companies in the value chains. Germany has stretched its legislation means it used the existing legislation and has expanded it to address this issue. And then in countries like France and the UK and Croatia, there has been a new special legislation introduced. There's new institutions which have been created to deal with it. So it's a very big difference in terms of regulatory approaches. In this slide, we have listed the countries from the most interventionist, if you want, or regulatory-wise. This is number 1 and 2, France and UK, and to the bottom where Denmark, etc. are. And so basically we compared this with how important UTPs have been in these countries based on the survey that has been done, and essentially there's no correlation, okay, which is quite surprising. Then the last point here is in terms of EU harmonization. Should we basically, because obviously we have a single market in agriculture and food products, should we then move from all these different regulations at the national level to a harmonized EU level? And so the question is, well, every time in principle people would like harmonization because obviously reduce transaction costs, etc. But of course the question is, are you harmonizing at the high level or are you harmonizing at the low level? Okay, and so at this point there is a big discussion in the EU. There are some regulations, and so the most recent thing is that there is a directive on UTPs, a European directive, which is introducing some regulations, which is kind of a medium level, if you want, of regulations compared to the different extremes. I can provide you with more details later. Okay, I've run out of time, so I will leave this here, okay? So regulations can have very long-lasting disruptive effects. International integration can lead to harmonization of useful regulation or not, and the removal of excessive regulation or to the spread of excessive regulation. Okay, and obviously they can prevent international integration, and this I think is a good example of how this is probably not going to happen for a while. And so the article I just showed was argued in early 2006. Negotiations were still claiming that there would be major progress expected by the end of 2016, which seems unlikely now. Right. Thank you very much.
Super, very interesting. Colleagues, as lunch tends to be overrated, we will eat a bit into the lunch break. I would like to first turn to our listeners, if they have, from Abuja and Addis Ababa, if they have any question or comment. Can we check if we hear them? We see you, colleagues, in the small pictures on the screen here. Can this be blown up?
Hi, this is Vikas from Addis Ababa.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Sure. Two quick questions. First of all, thank you for a very insightful presentation. Concur with everything that has been said. So one question for Tom. So Tom, when we are looking at this whole revolution in the agri-food system and the 5 pointers that you indicated, mostly at the demand end, would like to get a perspective from your side as to what has been the role of, first, public investments, second, in public financing and public subsidies or public incentives, and third, on public policy for making that transformative change. For example, you talked about India cold chain moved from 1% to 90% over a time span of 10 decades. So what has been the role of all of those three? So that's one. Second question, more for Maximo. So sitting in Ethiopia with 12.8% cell phone penetration rate as per your data, I don't feel that optimistic about the role of digital technologies, in agriculture in Ethiopia. Just came back from China 2 weeks ago, and there I felt very optimistic at the role of digital technology. So I want to get a sense from you when you look at this whole array of digital technology. I mean, there are a couple that have been mainstream, there are a couple that are ready to scale, there are a couple which are still at a piloting stage, and there are a couple which are still in R&D or science fiction phase. And when we are advising client countries such as Ethiopia, where digital dividend is still far remote, what would be your advice in terms of the pragmatism of which technologies are ready for scale and which are still in R&D phase? So those are two questions from Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Abuja, please.
Okay, yeah, we have two questions in Abuja. So mine is more of a comment and reinforcing Thomas's point about the value chain around chicken and grains, maize and soybeans particularly, and the growth. So I work with a commodities exchange based here in Nigeria that connects about 100,000 farmers across 60 communities to markets. So we see these, and our largest market pool is the feed milling sector that feeds into the protein diet, which is increasing. And what we've also seen, to reinforce your point, is that the demand of protein is increasing at a very fast rate, that the input requirements, seeds particularly, for products like soya beans and hybrid maize cannot catch up with the pace of the growth of the markets. So the other part to also reinforce is that some of the research has also shown that the fragmentation of the value chain and the number of players between initial producer to the final buyer is reducing. So you have fewer players and fewer intermediaries because players are having expanded capacity and can play a lot more function. So it moves between 2 to 3 people as against about 5 to 6 people 5-10 years before now.
Okay, Prof, you will introduce yourself.
Yes, I will want you to answer this question for me. In Nigeria, we have 2 major problems regarding agriculture. The first one is food insecurity, and the second one is low quality of agricultural exports to other countries. Many times, Nigerian agricultural products were denied access to some international markets that is not meeting the WTO. However, the government of the day is already focusing on policy framework, agricultural technology, infrastructure, finance and risk management, institutional reforms and alignments, and making agriculture to be a business and also focusing on the value chain approach. Is there any other strategy that you would like to provide to Nigeria to overcome these 2 major problems of food insecurity and low agricultural low quality of agricultural exports? Because we want Nigeria to boast exportation of agricultural produce, not to be denied at the international markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues in Abuja and Addis Ababa, please stay on the line. I would like to now turn to the audience and ask for 3-4 questions, and then turn back to the panel, which has taken note of your questions. Let me go from right to left. I see Alain de Janvry. Oh, there is a whole cluster of people there, a nest. The back is encouraged too. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you all want to speak, it can be only very brief. Alain, go ahead. Alain de Janvry.
I just want to mention that the key to responding to those transformations is really in the timing. We want to combine those major transformations that you have mentioned with inclusiveness and the Sustainable Development Goals. Social protection has to be part of the story. Question, in a sense, is how do we rethink what kind of social protection do we have to have into place in such a fashion that we minimize the negative implications of the disruptions you have been describing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next over there, please, madam. Introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, my name is Jean from the OECD, Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Thank you very much. That was very interesting presentations, and I hope they're going to feed my thinking about this digital technologies for the food system program that we're trying to develop. And to be quick, there was a few things that I think I would like to hear a bit more about, which is how would you think all those digital technologies are actually going to change the need for regulations and the need for policing in many ways, because the asymmetry of information is somehow disappearing. The second is, I think that it's been a bit talked about, I think, by Professor Readon, but it's the fact that it's the services side of things and how, we have all those services that were non-tradable and now are tradable, including extension services, and maybe the importance of other regulations that are going to prevent those services from being supply, for example, data flows issues, and maybe finally, well, actually, I can't find my third point. So
that's
I think
good enough.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next, Suresh Babu, IFPRI.
Thank you, Joachim. This question goes to Tom Reardon. Tom, you left us in Myanmar, but we are dealing with the policymakers asking the question about what is the implication of this value chain driving the investments, and where would you advise two places to invest in the growth of the retail markets, particularly? Okay, just two, to convert your research into policy and give us the answer. Also, you talked about the food system transformation. What is the implication of the increasing obesity due to urbanization in urban markets and processed foods? Is it good disruption or bad disruption? Of course, we know the answer, but I want you to think about that from your policy perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Next to Suresh, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. My question is to Tom. And I just wanted to appreciate, I think the presentation was quite inspiring. I appreciated how you looked at different parameters with regards to the food system. I may not have quite been comfortable with some of the statistics, but I guess it's because we're looking at a broad area, Africa and Asia combined. And I want to just put a caveat that as I ask this question, I'm limiting myself really to my knowledge of my little corner in Africa, that is in East Africa. My view is that if we are talking about food systems and we are looking at Africa specifically, I feel that we cannot be silent on the issue of post-harvest losses. I think it's quite a huge issue. And if you look at some of the statistics, even from FAO, although I couldn't get something very recent, the reports I've looked at are a bit dated, it says that 30 to 50% of food produced goes to waste. And actually it's higher for fruits and vegetables, and that is in Africa. So I would have liked to hear from you, Tom, in terms of transformation. How has that changed in Africa? What has transformation done, if there has been any transformation as regards to post-harvest losses in Africa? I think it's quite a significant issue. And I think that is, since time immemorial, since farmers started venturing out of subsistence farming, I think that has been a long-standing issue. Thank you.
Georg Daum, Hohenheim.
Yes, Thomas Daum, University of Hohenheim. I would have a question to Maximo. I would have a lot of questions, actually, but one to the power of kids. That's very fascinating, but I wonder, what are really the policy implications? And that may relate to the counterfactual or the control group. What if we would have a traditional extension system that functions properly?
Regina Birner.
A question to you. Thanks for this really interesting presentation. Can we actually explain why governments make the regulations they do? George Stiegler in 1971 showed that it has a lot to do with the industry being related, having political influence on these regulatory decisions. So how well developed is the political economy theory of regulation?
Who is angry if I cut it off now? One, go ahead. Micro.
Sorry. This is Oksana Gayetz. I'm with IFC. And a very quick question to Professor Reardon. I was wondering on the Nigeria example that you have given, to what extent your evaluation of that dynamic would be influenced by the fact that there is a very restrictive trade regime on poultry in place that translates into prices that are higher for domestic consumers by anywhere between 30 and 50%. So while I appreciate the benefits for the SMEs and the producers, given what you talked about in terms of the increasing purchases for rural, even rural consumers of food, how do we account for the distortions? Thank you.
And I add a question to Jo Swinnen. Your African Union President Kagame has called for and introduced common market rules for Africa. What can Africa learn from the European experience on the food safety regulation side in particular? What advice would we give Kagame? Let's start with Tom Reardon to respond to the questions, including the ones which we got from whoever wants to respond to them, but let's not forget them, from Abuja and others.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think I have 5 questions that were asked, and some of them I'll put together. The question from Adis was, to me, extremely relevant to thinking about the relations between public investments, public policy, and public finance, and relating that to some of the examples that were given. And I wanted to use one of my favorite of all examples from our work, is this confluence of change that occurred in the potato cold storage sector in India. And if you look at it, the key thing is to see it as a sequence of policy changes and public investments, followed by private investments, followed by public investments. And so it was a kind of a cascade of a dynamic working together. And the first thing that happened, of course, was the public policy of liberalization that led to income increases in the early 1990s and the late 1990s. When those income increases occurred and the total market of a place like Delhi increased, and you have to think about the Delhi market as being 15 to 20 million people, maybe surrounded by another 15 to 20 million people in nearby areas, that's a market the size of France. So suddenly, a market the size of France has incomes that are increasing quickly. Bennett's Law has it that they'd be buying potatoes. And the public investments that were then made in road expansion and surfacing were absolutely central to reduce the massive transaction cost and variability and access to that market. Once you had an access to that market, it's like putting a plug in the wall with electricity. And then, of course, I mentioned the word electricity. That was the third step. There was a huge investment in electrification of the Agra area, also in Bihar. And so the electrification then opened up another wave of response to the access to the market, which was investment in this kind of rural industrialization of cold storages. And the government did step in with some subsidies for cold storages, but we counted this as an incidence of 5% on the total investment. Once you have this trend toward possible demand in cold storage, the issue is there a shift from growing basic grains that they were growing there to potatoes. That required another wave, which was investment in pumps in irrigation facilities, which were done again by private farmers investing their money, often from rural non-farm employment that was gained from the interactions with the secondary cities and the main city. So the income that was coming from that confluence of the urbanization and income growth was being pumped into buying pumps, buying irrigation, and that was then fed by the electrification. Finally, with all of that demand calling, there was a shift by farmers from grains to potatoes. And the NARS, the National Agricultural Research System, looking ahead before really a lot of this change occurred, put in place a research program for shelf stability and disease reduction in potatoes, so that then they could go into cold storages and then the volumes of potatoes vastly increased. So if you look at what I just said, in a way there were some basic principles. One was the liberalization of the market and of incomes, the income growth that came from that. The second was essentially access and connecting to the main source of demand. Without that access, you wouldn't have had this change. Then you had to enable the change that occurred in that area, and it was a set of things that occurred, some of them far-sighted like the variety change, some of them really trying to increase overall economic activity in the area like roads and electrification. And so in that case, public investment was important, public policy was important, public finance was very little importance. And this is something that's fascinated me both in our work in Africa and in Asia, is that very typically subsidies as well, apart from fertilizer, subsidies in the supply chain and public finance has an extremely small incidence in overall investment in these supply chains. This is all money that's coming from the private sector, either in the local secondary cities or in small and medium enterprises in the rural area. So the idea is how to enable and empower that that wave of grassroots investments. And that confluence of things is what happened to make that occur. The second point that was brought up, okay, I will do this very fast, I think, relatively speaking. The Abuja, okay, the Abuja question was about what can spur the development of the maize and feed and chicken supply chains further in Nigeria. And I think someone made a key point, which is that the service sector, for example, the third-party logistics services, which are actually 85% of the total transport used by maize wholesalers in Nigeria, and the warehouse, the private warehouse market, which is actually 80% of all storage, these service sectors have grown enormously in very short time. Little is known about what plagues them in their further development in terms of energy and roads and policies. So understanding that hidden middle of services is extremely important to be able to affect change. I'd like to go further, but I better stop.
Please contact our speakers in the lunch break with unanswered questions and other questions. Maximo.
Okay, very quickly, the Ethiopia question, 12 to 12.8% of penetration. That's a policy problem, and it's, I think, a policy failure. I don't know if you're aware, but Ethiopia liberalized phones, cellular phones a few years ago, and the demand was massive, but then they only control it through a state-owned enterprise. Ethiopia is fiber optics covered completely, so technology can switch even from cellular to broadband, so it shouldn't be a problem. It's a problem of a decision, and it's a problem of enforcement of that decision. So I don't see any issue in terms of accessibility, just that there is a problem in terms of how the government wants to control the access to cellular phones. In the case of Alan, I think your question is crucial, and it's the same issue of trade. No? When you have trade openness, you have distributional effects. So how we do the sequencing? So for me, there are two elements. First is targeting. So where I can come up with these interventions, or where these new technologies, disruptive technology, can play a role that will assure that you will have income. And that's in areas where basically you have potential and you have inefficiency, and technologies could help to resolve those inefficiency. But the income that you will get by just reducing that inefficiency without a shift of the frontier could be enough to move you out of poverty. There are areas where that won't happen because you don't have the characteristics of the soil and so on and so forward. And in those areas, transfers will go. But the sequencing, because in both areas there is a lot of poor people, the sequencing on how I phase out the transfers, any type of transfer, to the technology and the shift in terms of reduction of efficiency is central. That's why I was arguing that the complements are central, and we cannot wait until the end. So for me, the sequencing is even, I will start first with thinking how to design these things before even making this to happen, because it will create a lot of distributional effects and all the three elements that I mentioned. So we need to be very careful, and that's why a place like the bank needs to be ready for that, to be able to resolve that and to avoid and minimize potential distributional effects in the best possible way. But targeting is central. When we look at countries in Africa and in Latin America, for example, and we see the targeting of policies, the mismatches are huge. We are doing irrigation when there is no need of irrigation. We are putting, for example, in West Africa, there is a huge program putting fertilizers, which is not the type of fertilizer that the land needs. So all those mismatches, we can resolve it. And then, of course, you have these potential disruptive technologies playing into place. Now, in terms of the digital technologies and the need to change of regulations, I think technology and the disruption of technologies create changes that happen immediately. And most of the cases, they will be faster than potential changes in regulations. So we need to figure out how to handle that and how to move in parallel. What you want at the end is to avoid too much market concentration of power. You want to avoid one company controlling everything, although it's good at the beginning to create innovation, as David was mentioning initially, but at the end of the line, when you have these specific investments and sunk costs, all the Sutton theory, you need to avoid that and to allow penetration and entry, new entry into the sector, and that's what you want to avoid. That was my example of the John Deere tractor, which I don't know if John Deere bought this technology to deploy it more, or John Deere bought this technology to put it to sleep, because it could create competition with them. So those are the things that we need to be alert, because we don't want to lose those options, but the market works pretty well on that. In some countries, no, and that again linked to the answer of the complement. In terms of the kids, the contrafactual here, the control group was brushing their teeth. Okay, that was the contrafactual, the control group. So it was an RCT design, and we're deploying it in other countries. The policy implication for the first stage, which was just information for kids for nutrition, was great, because if I want to give a nutritional campaign, for example, it's easy to do it in the school through videos, and the kids will enforce this with their parents. We know it works now. And even they can make their own decisions. In this case, it was taking an iron pill, and so on and so forth. When it goes up to the parents, again, my perception, these are secondary kids, these are not primary kids at school. My perception is that the kids have something else that the robot doesn't have the feeling of knowing their parents and understanding from the parent. So they can translate this thing and make the parent hear, and we learn that. But there are heterogeneous effects. Male, female, male is different, and that's part what we are finding. But I think there is a lot of work to be continued on that, but it could make a lot cheaper to do any potential extension intervention, for example, or even knowledge on how to use this technology so that they can help their parents when they are doing it. Of course, it's sensitive, child labor, you want to avoid that, but on the other hand, new technologies can minimize the health effects that the current work they do have, like, for example, herbicides and how they are contaminated by doing that, because they really work today. So how we can improve and get to a second best, I think will be ideal.
We should leave it at that. Jo?
Yes. Okay. Thank you for these questions. In terms of, first Regina's question, in terms of the state of the art of the political economy theory of regulation, Stigler's early work on that, which he wrote on political economy theory of regulation, he is essentially his theoretical work, and he kind of assumed that you can measure it, okay, in his model. And if you think from that perspective, there's quite a bit of literature out there. The problem with these types of regulation I talked about today is how do you measure these? Okay, the empirical side is very difficult. So we've had a huge political economy literature on agriculture protection, taxation, etc. And why was that? Because we had good indicators. Okay, first the Kruger-Schiff-Valdez study, then the OECD indicators, then Kim Anderson's work. And so we could look both at the extent of distortions, etc. The problem with the type of regulation I talked about is we don't have this type of indicators. And that's part of the story I was telling initially. It's actually very hard to measure, okay? Because we can even say, if I looked at the 28 examples, okay, so you have differences in regulation, but what's the optimal level of regulation? How does it distortive affect them? It's just very hard to do. There's a couple of things like Alessandro Olper and his team have done work on GMO regulation different, and they find that the more trade there is with the EU, the closer that the GM systems look like the EU, which is kind of, intuitive if you want. We've done some work on land regulations, but again, the indicators are hard to capture. And then Joachim's question on my advice to the African president, or the president of the African Union. Well, I think, if you think about, if you see it as the optimal level, as taking into account the benefits for the consumers and the implementation cost, that is, even if you assume that African consumers put just as much, basically, attention or the welfare effect is the same on the food safety side, the implementation costs are definitely going to be higher in Africa than they are in the EU, I think, because of the institutional, lack of capacity, but also capital markets, knowledge systems, etc. So I think probably what I would advise them look at, because the implementation of the regulation in Europe as well is still different. So I would look at the most cost-effective way it has been implemented in different ways in Europe and start from that and see whether this would be a good base to start. And of course it depends on whether Tom's numbers are right. If 90% of everything is domestic, then or 50% of the economy is exported, that really depends on the nature of the food safety or food quality regulations that you need, I think.
Well, colleagues, this was a set of power talks, all three solidly rooted in theory and experience, great case stories, a lot to learn from. A round of applause to our three disruptors. Thank you. Lunch and then poster session in 45 minutes. And thank you to Abuja and to Addis Ababa. You were the great contributors.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah, I guess I hear your audio coming in.
Okay. So we have a camera up here, so I'll do the sync test up here if that's all right with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
Whoa. Hold on, let me kill the speaker here. Stand by.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yeah, no effect. Let me just take a look at it on the stream real quick.
Okay.
Hold on a minute. You can take it a little on that one.
Okay.
Okay, we're like live and not streaming. That's good. Like, I didn't tell it to stop streaming. Why did it? Oh, somebody stopped the stream. I wonder who stopped. Well, I'm just listening to it, and I can see it still looks out of sync coming down from you upstairs.
Okay.
So,
So I'm wondering if maybe there's a device in the rack room across the hall. I'm not, 100% familiar with all the equipment in here, but since
the frame store.
yeah, since we're not having the same issue on our local KeyPro,
I'll have to investigate it some.
okay, all right,
We'll look into it later on. But
okay, all right, yeah,
now I gotta find out who stopped the stream on me.
yeah, Let me know if you need some.
Somebody stopped it.
Yeah, let me know if you need me to go beat somebody up.
We got the backup here. See ya.
All right, thanks, Larry. Bye bye.
Alright, dude, I'm gonna go break.
Yep.
You good?
Yeah.
Need
We're gonna.
anything else?
What time we come back at 1:15?
It's said 1:30. They're gonna come back, but
What time should we be back?
yeah, 1:20.
1:20. Okay.